Hello, welcome to Glasgow Rangers Nation with me, your host, Owen James, guys. Let's talk all things Rangers. Look, we've got a few things to talk through this morning, this afternoon, this evening. Depends, obviously, when you watch the video. First of all, we're going to talk about Leon Balogun, who has played his final game for Rangers, much to his surprise and sadness. We'll talk a little bit about that. We're also going to talk a little bit as well about the managerial hunt, which is still obviously ongoing. Steven Gerrard looking like he's moving ahead in the kind of managerial stakes there. So a few things to get through here on the channel today. Right, let's start off with the news about big Leon Balogun. Look, I'm sad because I love Big Leon. Big Leon is he's fantastic. I mean, I've always loved Big Leon. He's a Rangers man through and through. He's someone who always gives his all for the club. He never gives up. He never lets his head go down. You know, he's not one of those players you can ever accuse of downing tools, of shirking responsibility, of giving up, of quitting, of being a serial loser like our captain. You know, none of those things you can level at Leon Balogun. This man is, Rangers to the core. If you cut him in half, he'd bleed red, white and blue. And he's given some fantastic displays. Even at 36, he's been, fantastic at times this season. Even when injured, I mean, I remember the game was at St Mirren away. The guy, I think his hamstring had gone at the point, or his calf had gone or something, and yet he still chases the St Mirren player back on one leg and slide tackles him to make sure he kills off the danger before he goes down and asks for treatment. That is the fight this man had, and if the 10 other individuals on the pitch had had the same fight, heart and desire as Big Leon, you know what, I think we probably would have won the league this season. I think, look, I love Leon, and I love that goal he scored this season, the winner, Ibrox as well, that header to win the game. Who was that again? I can't remember who that was against now, but that was one of the greatest moments this season for me. It's one of my highlights of this very, very bad season for the club, and Big Leon is just the man. I love that man to bits, and I always will. A true Rangers legend, much more so than others who are put into that category. Balogun, though, I think, look, as sad as it is that he's going, we've kind of reached the point where, due to all the injuries he was sustaining, due to the fact that he'd missed an awful lot of time, and when he did come back from injury, he was then getting injured again very quickly. Maybe his body was trying to tell him that, look, Leon, this is the time to stop, mate. You can't carry on at this level. Your injuries are catching up with you. And I think that's probably why the club didn't offer him a new deal. However, I do think the club should have told him before, the end of the season that this would be his last two games, and I think it's sad that they didn't really give him the opportunity to, over those last two games, particularly the last one at Ibrox, to say goodbye to the fans, because this is a guy who has given his all for this club, and I think the club are very remiss in doing that. And, I think it's just another example of the very bad mismanagement that at times we've suffered at this club from the CEO right down to the past and present and whoever manages, although we don't have a manager at the moment, so there we go. He said that in an interview that he's very saddened that he is leaving and was never given the opportunity to say goodbye to the fans, which I think, like I said, is absolute disgrace on behalf of the club. He says, if I'd known the last two games of the season were my last, I would have made sure to say goodbye to you all accordingly. Unfortunately, I wasn't afforded that opportunity, which saddens me, as I would have liked to have walked around Ibrox one last time and returned all the love and support you've given me during my two stints. Look, I think this is the big thing. This is where Rangers have perhaps again scored another own goal in terms of, their kind of their PR side of things, the way they've kind of conducted themselves. They have shafted Big Leon to some degree, and personally, I just think this is a bit of a disgrace. I think it is a bit of a disgrace. I mean, whoever is responsible for this, whether it's Kevin Thelwell, whether it's Niels Coppen, whether it's that dickhead Patrick Stewart, I don't know, who is responsible, but I think not allowing Big Leon to have his 5 minutes in the sun at Ibrox, okay, it was dark, but you know what I mean, to say goodbye properly is an absolute downright disgrace, and it's wrong. It's wrong. Especially as, other players who perhaps haven't deserved that same kind of limelight have got it, or people who've done their job very badly have got much more of a limelight to say goodbye, rather than Big Leon, who has never ever let this club down. So look, personally speaking, it's sad that he's going. It's probably the right decision, but it was done in the wrong way. And that's the thing I kind of saying that, that people say, "Oh, you're slagging the club off again." Well, no, I'm slagging off the decision because it's a wrong decision that someone who quite clearly loves the club and wants this club to do well and is basically like a fan in the way that he loves, gives the passion, the heart, has been treated again badly by the club. And I think that is very wrong. And I really feel for Big Leon. This is a guy who's never let this club down. He's not a player, like I said, who you could ever accuse of giving up. And also, I think, the other thing as well, one of the big things for me with Big Leon is that he is always given everything for this club. And he's always been honest. Always been honest. I mean, there's times in interviews when the managers come out and spouted absolute shit for the post-match interview. Yeah, he's come out and he's been absolutely honest. That wasn't good enough. We need to look at ourselves, etc., etc. And it's okay for a player to do that, not for a manager. Managers shouldn't throw their players under the bus. That's unprofessional. Very unprofessional. But for Big Leon to do it, it is spot on. I mean, this guy's played over 100 games for Rangers, 107 games, scored 3 goals. He's been a fantastic servant for the club. And I think, like I said, he deserved the opportunity to say goodbye in the right way. He really genuinely did. So I'm sad. I'm sad that he leaves. I wish him all the best. I mean, personally, like I said, I know that it's perhaps the right time to do this, to allow him to leave because of all these injuries and stuff. In an ideal world, I would have preferred it that he had the opportunity to perhaps get another year and have like a farewell tour. That would have been great. But look, at the end of the day, you've got to make the right decisions for the club to move forward. And it's just, like I said, it's just the manner in which it's been taken. I'm not saying it's the wrong decision to allow him to go. What I'm saying is it's the wrong decision, the way the decision has been taken. And players and fans' feelings do need to be taken into account. But hey, let's face it, Patrick Stewart doesn't give a shit about the fans, does he? Right, let's move along a little bit. Let's talk a little bit of managerial news. Look, now, who the next manager is going to be? Look, I don't think any of us actually genuinely know. There's so much in the media at this moment in time. If you type Rangers into a search or Rangers manager into a search, you get absolutely shed loads. You get so much information. About who's taking over, who the next manager is going to be. I think there's obviously a short list. There's obviously people being spoken to. The new owners are obviously playing an active part. Obviously, even though the takeover hasn't been concluded, you've got to obviously see it as the fact that the discussion is taking place. There is clearly discussions and they are clearly playing a part, because at the end of the day, you can't have the present board, who are absolutely hopeless, and Patrick Stewart, who is absolutely hopeless, and Niels Coppen, who is absolutely hopeless, taking a decision that then influences when the new owners come in and they go, well, I didn't want him, I wanted someone else. So you've obviously got to say that Kevin Thelwell, that even though Kevin Thelwell hasn't officially taken up his job yet, because the Everton still haven't finished their season yet. And obviously the new owners, and Andrew Kavanagh, Parag Marathe, Greta Steinson, obviously, who is obviously not an owner, but part of that ownership structure, with his advice that he gives to the group. I think there is very much a situation there where they will be advising, they will be giving their input, and they will be playing a part in this discussion. I think, there's quite clearly a shortlist there. There's quite clearly 4 or 5 candidates that are clearly being spoken to. The merit of those candidates are open for discussion, and I'm sure you all have your opinions. You all have your opinions on who you want as the next manager. I think if you ask me to kind of put my money where my mouth is in terms of who are those 4 or 5 candidates that are on that shortlist, it appears that I think Steven Gerrard is very much on that list. Russell Martin is very much on that list. I think that Marco Rosa is on that list. I think that Rob Edwards is on that list. I think that Davide Ancelotti is still on that list. I think Sean Dyche may well be on that list. If you push me, they'd be the 6 names that I'd kind of bring up. And we can all have our own views. Derek McInnes obviously is now the new manager of Hearts. I still think personally Derek McInnes could have done a good job at Rangers. He certainly, I think, would have done a better job if he'd been given the team from when Clement was sacked to the end of this season. I think he would have done a far better job than Barry Ferguson, because Derek McInnes is a coach, someone who would have organised the team. as poor as the players are at the moment in terms of their actually, I think McInnes would have got a little bit more out of them, and I think he wouldn't have thrown them under the bus and slagged them off in the media, which obviously would have had an impact. So I do think he probably would have done a better job than Barry Ferguson. But I think he's obviously out of the running now. He's now the new Hearts manager, and I think he'll do very, very well next season. Obviously, with the extra investment they've got from Tony Bloom, the owner of Brighton, I think Hearts will have a very good season next season. But looking at who we've got down there on that list of 6 names, and I think whoever it is, this decision has to be made fairly quickly. We need to start putting into place these key components for next season, given the fact that obviously Champions League qualifying draws in June, the Champions League qualifiers come up in July fairly early, so we need to get the team ready to hit the ground running for those Champions League qualifiers. As I've said on numerous occasions, we cannot afford another season in the Europa League, and like I said, when I hear this, it's Rangers level. Oh, we all love a Rangers Thursday night. That's the best. We don't want to be. It just makes me sick. It makes me sick that the lack of ambition of certain fans, that they don't have that ambition. No, we don't want to play in the Champions League because Celtic did okay in the Champions League this season. They qualify for the knockout, but if they can do it, we can do it. I think if you're one of those fans that sits there and says, that I'd rather play in the Europa League, it's our level, you're showing a real lack of ambition, and you need to give your head a bit of a wobble. I think, at the end of the day, we can compete in the Champions League with the right investment, with the right manager. There is a potential there to invest. I think, you look at that new league phase, there are some shit teams in that league phase that, you can beat. Celtic, yes, did lose to Dortmund, did lose to Villa, but they still beat some absolute shite in that league phase. And I think, we've obviously beaten Celtic twice this season, drawn with them once, and had a pretty good record against them. So I think you've got to look at it that way. If we can do that against them, then we can obviously beat the likes of Slovan Bratislava, for example, and Young Boys of Bern, Celtic's second favourite team. But looking at that list of managerial candidates, Steven Gerrard, Russell Martin, Davide Ancelotti, Marco Rosa, Rob Edwards, Sean Dyche. I think that obviously is the list. I'm guessing. I don't know. There could be another name. There could be someone comes out of left field. That appears to be what the media are suggesting. The people in the know are suggesting. The ITK sources. I think realistically, out of those 6, I think Davide Ancelotti has the drawbacks. Obviously, that he won't join up with the club until later on due to his commitments to his father. Marco Rosa, I still do think would be a very good appointment. This is a guy who plays a Jurgen Klopp brand of football, and no, Jurgen Klopp is not going to Roma. If anyone writes that in the comments, that was confirmed by his agent this morning, and no, he's not coming to Glasgow either. Marco Rosa, I think, would be a very, very good appointment. I think he plays a Klopp style of football. He plays the Gegenpress, a high press, an active attacking phase. He's got Champions League experience. He's got Europa League experience. He's managed in a very difficult league. The Bundesliga was a much harder league than our league. So I think, he's very much a decent candidate. Danny Röhl, I think, is not a candidate due to the huge release clause. That people say, well, he's resigned. Surely he would cost nothing. Well, actually, he would cost because there is a clause in his contract that states that it's up until June 2027. Anyone who wants to take him on as manager will have to pay compensation to Sheffield Wednesday, amounting to about £11 million. Now, I can't see Rangers spending £11 million on a manager at this stage. Russell Martin, I think, is a candidate. Someone who has got managerial experience, has a good brand of football. Obviously, the downside to Russell Martin is the fact that when he was managing at the top level in England, he failed spectacularly. That he doesn't have a plan B. That may be something that he's changed now. You never know. He may have learnt from his mistakes, and he may have now got a plan B to overcome that difficulty of, when his plan A doesn't work. Plan B at that time for Southampton was to do plan A, but try and do it better with different players. Very Philippe Clement-esque. So, I think Martin is a candidate. Dyche, I don't think is a candidate. I think he is someone who the media have kind of put 2 and 2 together. Got 5 because he's associated with Kevin Thelwell. Thelwell appointed him at Everton. I think Dyche is I'm sure I've read somewhere that Dyche had spoken on this and said that he's not ready to return to management yet. So I think we can kind of rule him out, thank goodness. But Rob Edwards, another one. Someone had a go at me in the comments for slagging off Rob Edwards the other day, but Rob Edwards is, Luton, his Luton team, which were an absolute bunch of dirty thugs. They really were. There were like 11 football bouncers that just kicked the crap out of everybody. To be honest with you, it'd be like watching if Rob Edwards was Rangers manager, it would be like watching St Johnstone or Ross County play, or or Dundee play. It would basically just be watching 11 players kick the crap out of the opposition for 90 minutes. That's Rob Edwards football mixed in with a bit of hoofball, to the big man up front. I think that would be the tactic that, so me, Rob Edwards would be a disastrous appointment. Certainly not someone I'd want to ever see in the Ibrox dugout. The discussion comes back to Steven Gerrard. There seems to be an awful lot of people perceivably in the know. And like I said, I think a lot of these in the know sources are full of shit, to be honest with you. Saying that, look, Steven Gerrard's going to be the next Rangers manager. Steven Gerrard will be the next Rangers manager. It's all but done and dusted. Look, I don't know on that one. I genuinely don't. I think he is obviously in consideration. He, I think, loves the club, as he said. I think he would love an opportunity to come back and continue what he had done previously. People talk about the past with Gerrard. And yes, he failed at Aston Villa spectacularly, and I think that's obviously, I think, be a great regret for him and something that needs to be looked at. Obviously a team that then Unai Emery added to with some extra players and took on to achieve great things. They did well in the Champions League this season. They pushed Paris Saint-Germain close, who are in the Champions League final. They look to be like they're going to get back in the Champions League this season. They're a great side, Villa. They're a very good side. I don't live far from Birmingham. I know a lot of Villa fans, and they all speak very highly of Unai Emery and not very highly of Steven Gerrard. I think, the El Etifaki thing, I think, people say, well, he was a failure in Saudi. Well, was he really? I think, if you compare his team, like CJ Novo said on his video, I mean, that's a brilliant video, guys, go and watch it. CJ said about, the fact that he didn't have a Benzema, he didn't have a Ronaldo, he didn't have a John Duran, he said he didn't have any of those top world stars. I think Fofana was about the most famous top player he had at El Etifaki, and he had Moussa Dembele, he had John Henry. He didn't have any great players there. So look, compared to the teams in the league, probably finishing mid-table was about fair for El Etifak in terms of who finished above them. The Al Hilals, the Nassers, etc., of this world, or the Al Alis, or whatever they're called, or the Ik-Bin-9 whatevers, or the Osama bin Laden FC, whatever, or the Islamic Jihad Athletic or whatever, whoever finishes highest in that league, I don't know. But look, so I mean, I think you can kind of write that one off. You can only look at what Gerrard did in Scotland, and the fact that he came into the club that was not doing very well at all. He turned the club round. He put in place a structure that was effective. He got the players fit. He took us to win 55, undefeated. He stopped 10 in a row. He had a good record against Celtic. He's got a lot of the criteria there. And, sometimes you find with managers that they manage better in certain leagues than other leagues, and they don't cope in other leagues, just like players. I mean, Philippe Clement, for example. Let's take Clement. Clement looks like a world beater in the Belgian Pro League. He's won league titles, cups with Genk and Bruges, and I think he was linked with the Anderlecht job. And I'm sure if he got a job in the Belgian Super League next year, or the Jupiler League, or whatever the hell the league's called, he probably will be very successful because that's his league. That's where he's more at home. And you look at other managers, some of the Italian managers that have come out of Italy that have not been able to manage anywhere else but Serie A. You look at those guys. So there's kind of that argument that certain players and certain managers can only cope in certain leagues. Maybe Scotland is Gerrard's league. Maybe that's the league that he can cope in. Maybe that's the league he can. And I mean, Ange Postecoglou, for example, amazing at Celtic, as much as I hate to say it, but awful at Tottenham. I mean, they're fourth off bottom this season. I mean, had the fact that the three championship clubs were so dreadful that came up, maybe Tottenham might have been relegated this season. That's how mad this is. And yes, I know he did get them to a Europa League. He's obviously got them to a Europa League final. And I hope they beat Manchester United because I hate Manchester United. But, I think maybe Gerrard's right league is this league, that if he comes back, that he will be able to put in place those things that he put in before, and he'll finally have owners that are willing to back him. That was, I think, the big issue. People talk about, well, he walked away, that's unforgivable, but we kind of don't know the real reasons, or we kind of can guess the reasons. But I think, a lot of why he walked away, and this is just my opinion, was because Douglas Park, being the absolute useless, lazy waste of space that he is, didn't back his manager, didn't do what Gerrard asked him to do, which was to fix the roof while the sun was shining. Obviously, his ridiculous response at the AGM, win more things. I mean, let's face it. I mean, it's like watching it's like watching some. I don't know, lunatic who's escaped from some sort of mental asylum, isn't it? And the Park family, let's face it, I'm so glad they're going. It's going to be so much better for the club that they're not involved anymore. And I hope all the advertising, the Park buses, the Park Motor Group, all that gets set on fire and got rid of from the club. Nice big bonfire at Ockenhowie to get rid of all that Park crap. Not their businesses. Obviously, don't touch their businesses. Please don't do that. But obviously, anything clothing-wise, advertising, hoarding-wise, or flag-wise, if Park Motor Group on, nice big bonfire, get a bit of Barbie going. That'd be good to get rid of the Park Motor Group and park this and park that. Let's just park it somewhere else. But, look, at the end of the day, we are moving on. And maybe, Gerrard comes in now and has that backing, has that ability to take the club on. And that's got to be a big thing for me. It really does. And, look, if it is Gerrard, I think it's a good appointment. I think it is a very good appointment. I think he'll bring in his own coaches. I don't think that'll be Michael Beale, but you'll be relieved to know. So, look, I think the club is moving forward. It is really genuinely moving forward now, and that's a positive. So, look, this managerial appointment is key. It is absolutely key. We all know that. We all know that. We all know that whoever it's going to be, it has to be the right person to take this club forward. And people can talk about rebuilds and time and blah, blah, blah. But, with the greatest respect, you don't get that at Rangers. You don't get time. People will not say, if people talk about, well, it's going to take 2-3 seasons to get this right. People will not sit there, in the Broom Loan, in the Sandy Jardine, in the Copeland and watch, Celtic win titles across the city whilst we struggle. It's just not acceptable, and people don't have the patience for that, and Rangers fans don't have the patience for that. So, realistically, and this is the big thing, guys, whoever has to come in has to hit the ground running, has to get us ready for Europe, has to get this team ready to compete for the start of the season. Like I said, it is just not acceptable. And look, we can all try and be as reasonable-minded as we want, but that if at Christmas, 2025, we are sat there 10 points behind Celtic, their fans will be absolutely up in arms. There will be a revolution on the hands again, and there'll be demands for the manager to be sacked, and demands for this, and demands for that, and calls for this player to be sold, and that player to be sold. And, I think we all know that. We can all pretend that we're going to be really calm and reasonable-minded, and we're all going to sit there and go, oh, no, he's got time. He needs to build his squad. He needs windows, blah, blah. But as well as I do, that if we're sat there, Christmas 2025, 10 points behind Celtic, you're going to be screaming and calling and whinging and moaning about the team and wanting change. That's just how things are. That's a football fan. That's what football fans are like. It's just how it works out, doesn't it? How it works out. Guys, I'd love to know your thoughts on the managerial vacancy, on what you think of the candidates that are being linked, who you'd prefer out of that list. I don't think Muscat's in the running. I don't think Knutson's in the running, for those of you. I know that's a couple of names that have been mentioned repeatedly in the comments. I genuinely don't think that is on or is going to happen at all. Guys, thank you for watching Glasgow Rangers Nation. If you've enjoyed the content, please like, comment, share and subscribe. If you're going to comment and be abusive and call me a specky tube or something like that, you're going to get deleted and banned, so please don't even bother. Thank you for watching. As always, guys, on the way out, please remember we are the people.